All right, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this second installment of the EPPAC Energy Policy Planning Advisory Council meeting. Today we have a pretty packed agenda. We wanted to have this meeting as a second chance to go through a lot of the questions folks had because we kind of had to cut a few of the conversations short last week. So we'll be trying to leave some time at the end here, about 30 minutes to go through any of those remaining open questions. But to start today, we wanted to give a special presentation from NYSERDA on their supply curve analysis that will be instrumental in the planning build out of renewable resources that we'll see in the capacity expansion model. This is a tool that has been under development for some time now. Actually wasn't initially developed exclusively for the CGPP. It just happens to be an incredibly detailed resource we're going to be able to take advantage of. So I wanted to just lay out the process for today. We're going to start with the presentation from NYSERDA on the supply curve analysis. We're going to do that for about 20 minutes, hopefully, leave some time, maybe 5 or 10 minutes for questions there, and then leave the last 30 minutes of the meeting to questions and discussion about other items. This time, we are going to ask that all questions on the presentation be held to the end and put in the chat, and we'll be going through the chat at the end to list those questions for the NYSERDA team to answer. And then as we go, we can get into more discussion, hopefully mostly through the chat as well in the second half of the meeting on the broader issues, so we can manage it because we are going to have upwards of 40 or so people on the call today. So that's the process. And so if there are no questions, I was going to hand it over to NYSERDA, but are there any other clarifying questions before we jump in? Okay, great. Mac, I will hand it over to you for your supply curve presentation then, and maybe some introductions from your team.
Certainly. Thanks, Skylar. Let me get my video going here and my screen shared. Give me one moment. Let's make this a little bigger for folks. All right, so for just a quick check, am I coming through okay? And can you see the screen there, Skylar?
Everything looks great.
Okay, great. Hi, folks. My name is Mac Farrell. I'm a senior project manager on NYSERDA's large-scale renewables team. I was going to walk you through a presentation today. I'm accompanied by a couple of colleagues from Power Advisory, Andrew Kinross and Greg Peniak, who will help me out a little bit in the Q&A session, as well as I think a few other NYSERDA staffers, Dave Kaup on the line. I know everyone's eagerly waited the presentation on the LSR supply curve. I just wanted to note that an expanded version of this presentation was included in the meeting materials I sent ahead of today's meeting. I've chopped down that deck a little bit in the interest of time. So if there are elements that you see are missing, please note that they are included in that original submission in more detail. But we'll mostly be using solar as sort of a representative technology to describe the methodology behind the supply curve today. But again, without further ado, let me jump right into it here. They start on purpose and context. So earlier this year, NYSERDA contracted the Power Advisory team, which included subcontractors VHB and Aquilo Energy, to develop an Excel-based large-scale renewables supply curve tool. And this was supposed to be a uniform set of information that could be used by NYSERDA in various internal modeling activities, but also leveraged for broader power system planning efforts like the NYSO System Resource Outlook or the Coordinated Grid Planning process. The tool produces capacity availability, cost values, and capacity factor estimates for potential solar, land-based wind, and offshore wind builds from the time period 2023 until 2040. To move on. We have a quick disclaimer here that was included in the deck sent around. I won't belabor this, but if you'd like to take a closer look at the Power Advisory disclaimer, it's included in the materials sent before the meeting today. We'll get right into the overall methodology used for the supply curve here. The work that we did started with a GIS analysis. For solar and wind, we determined the available sites for development for wind and solar projects that could be greater than 5 megawatts AC. We screened out protected land areas, particularly sensitive land areas in New York State, as well as areas with an overly large amount of agricultural value. Attributes were attached to each of these sites, things like distance to transmission, utility service area, that sort of thing. And then these sites were aggregated into resource blocks that could then be filtered into the supply curve. I'll provide a little more detail and imagery on the GIS analysis in a couple slides. But for offshore wind, the GIS work that was done took existing lease areas, known existing lease areas off the coast of New York State, and also modeled potential lease areas that could be used for floating offshore wind in much later years, and then determined the technical potential in megawatts that could be available off the coast for for offshore wind, based on project density assumptions. Once the GIS work was concluded, we worked on the data inputs for CapEx, OpEx, capacity factors, establishing some financial parameters, and interconnection costs for the solar, wind, and offshore wind for 23 through 40. We were not just going off of book research here. Power Advisory specifically conducted firsthand interviews with developers working on wind, solar, and offshore wind developments in New York State to get a sense of the near-term inflationary environment. These interviews were held over the summer and were factored into the data inputs for the supply curve. Finally, it was time to input everything into an Excel-based tool. We developed, the Excel-based tool provides the following outputs primarily: resource block technical resource potential over time. It applies an annual phase-in algorithm that applies the availability for wind, solar, and offshore wind over time based on the cost and performance expectations of those resource blocks. And then it provides overall available capacity for New York State from 23 through 40. The user of the supply curve tool does have a little bit of flexibility and can apply some settings in the Excel-based tool itself. Things like whether they want to screen out or include projects that are currently contracted to NYSERDA for REC contracts, screenings based on distance or proximity to transmission, to screening out or in projects that are have made a certain amount of progress in the interconnection queue, or also including or excluding projects that have a certain proximity to transmission. I forget if I said that already. All right. Moving on here. I did want to just give a look at the GIS analysis. You'll have to squint at this. I apologize. But just to get a general sense of the dispersion of solar sites for New York State after the analysis was completed, you'll notice big holes for the Adirondack and Catskill Parks and Preserves. But here's what the solar dispersion looked like. That was filtered into the supply curve. Land-based wind. And for offshore wind, I did want to give a little bit more of an in-depth explanation. These green lease areas, these are what we're calling the existing lease areas. The actual megawatts that flow through to the supply curve tool are only those that are currently contracted or available for contracting to New York State. So if there's a wind project that is contracted to another state, those megawatts are not available in the supply curve at the moment. This could be updated over time as contracts are either maintained or broken. And then I also wanted to explain the floating offshore wind technology in the brown areas, the FL, floating lease areas, which are meant to be representative of potential floating offshore wind technical potential in the future, or I should say floating offshore wind lease areas in the future. These are deeper than the 60-meter continental shelf break, and are meant to provide a potential future for offshore wind, or for floating offshore wind, so that could be captured in the supply curve. But I will note that the floating technology is not available as a resource until 2038. So there's just a short window where it factors in and can be selected as a potential resource in any future end use modeling. So those are our offshore wind resource blocks. We'll go now to our data inputs. We'll reiterate here, I chopped this down quite a bit, really to just look at the solar and some land-based wind sides in the interest of time. But I will start with the solar CapEx forecasting methodology, which is meant to be illustrative of solar, wind, and also offshore wind. Power Advisory started with their sort of baseline knowledge of New York State cost research, which they've been conducting for years, and looked at the latest available industry forecasts for CapEx and OpEx. Supplemented that, as I said, with first-hand interviews with developers on the ground. We're working on developing the 3 different technologies to try and capture not only impacts on cost, but also project development time, construction time, and just any other sort of supply chain or choke points that are impacting their project development, and tried to factor those into the project costs and resource potential within the supply curve. I would also just note that these costs were regionalized based on labor rates, prevailing wage rates within, I believe, at the county level across the state. So there's another adjustment that was made to try and get as much granularity on cost as possible. The result can be previewed here. We've compressed a couple of different metrics for you here, but the figures below represent real 2023 dollar forecast for solar and land-based wind. I would just note that the labor share assumed for CapEx is 17% for solar and 10% for land-based wind. That's where those prevailing wage differences start to factor in. And then that's adjusted by county to account for prevailing wage differences. Sorry, as I said. For solar, we start around the $1.70, $1.80 per watt DC range for a 10 megawatt project. Note these are bucketized for solar at 10 megawatt versus a representative 100 megawatt. We have a little less than that, about $1.59 for 100 megawatt, and they level out to approximately the $1.20 range by 2040. For land-based wind, we are showing actually the 3 different cost scenarios in this chart that Power Advisory had developed. And so we start in approximately the $2,400 per kilowatt range that maintains relatively flat for the moderate scenario, which is sort of the baseline and default scenario within the model. But it could increase over time in a high case scenario, could decrease somewhat in a low case scenario. Also want to touch on capacity factor and density assumptions. Just noting that we used a 1.3 to 1 DC-AC ratio for solar, or inverter ratio for solar. The average capacity for the state was approximately 2.4%. I should say approximately was 2.4%, with a range from 19.9 to 22.9. And that's partly resulting from a capacity density of 65 megawatts per square kilometer assumed for solar. For wind, we had a 36% average capacity factor, ranging from 22 to 42%. The capacity density there assumed to be 3 megawatts per square kilometer for land-based wind. Getting into other inputs. I wanted to know these financial parameters, if anyone saw these in the attached deck. These are sort of best case or best guess assumptions for cost of debt, cost of equity, leverage percentage, and debt tenor. These sorts of things were touched on by Power Advisory in their research and interviews with developers. I would just note that these are included in the supply curve mostly as an illustration, a sort of suggestion for financial parameters that an end-use modeler could use. These specific values do not actually flow through to the CapEx values. It's more well, it's just another resource for the end-use modeler if they're able to incorporate financial assumptions into their modeling. But I did want to sort of give that qualifier because I know folks may have been curious about this slide. Right. Also, we'll just note that we have a slightly different values for the very near term for 2023 solar versus what is being considered sort of the status quo, what the financial parameters are assumed to sort of level out as in later years. Okay, the tool itself, some of this will seem a little bit repetitive, but just reconfirming, the tool itself has user inputs. They can adjust those settings, like which resource blocks they want to consider based on distance to transmission, amount of, or excuse me, whether they're contracted or not contracted to NYSERDA already, whether they want to incorporate the investment tax credit into CapEx. We have a few different filters that the user can apply. The user can also tinker with the offshore wind to point of interconnection selections. At the moment, we have this set to sort of the least cost set of permutations between an offshore wind site and a New York State-based point of interconnection. The user can adjust those if they want to, and that will flow through to the offshore wind cost. And then GIS sites can be adjusted by the end user. They do have to go outside of the Excel-based model and use a web-based, ArcGIS-based program that VHB developed for this project. But if the user wanted to adjust or radically change the GIS assumptions underlying the supply curve model, there is a way for them to do that in ArcGIS, and that flows into a Excel-based CSV format that can then be very easily input into the model, and the resource blocks will adjust around that. Just addressing the assumptions that are baked into the model. We do have the financing parameters here, but again, those don't flow into the cost. Those are just sort of suggestive. But the CapEx and OpEx forecasts definitely flow through into the resource blocks. The interconnection queue assumption is input into the model and can be adapted as can be updated as the queue evolves. Interconnection costs are baked in. And I did just want to note a number of other assumptions. I mentioned the labor cost multiplier to capture those prevailing wage assumptions at the county level. There are, of course, variations in locational capacity factors, some adjustments to capacity density, and CapEx scaling, as well as the investment tax credit, which is currently set as it's defined in the IRA today. And the outputs you get from the supply curve are resource blocks, and that annual phase-in process, which I'll look at in just a moment, the amount of capacity available to you for the three different technologies, their capacity factors, their CapEx, their OpEx, their interconnection CapEx. The reason I'm listing all of those out is to point out that they are disaggregated. We are not lumping together all of the costs for a particular resource block, a particular technology into one final value. You can see how the CapEx values apply, how the OpEx values apply, the interconnection values apply. And you can, in fact, even adjust whether you want a high, low, or medium cost scenario for the three different technologies. You could use moderate for two, high for one, something like that. I should also mention at this point that we included the NREL ATB cost forecasts in the Excel-based tool as well, if a user wanted to rely on those instead of the forecasts that were developed by the Power Advisory and NYSERDA team. And I think that is everything I wanted to cover in this slide. We'll get into the phase-in approach. Just wanted to cover this for folks. First thing to note, the chart here is meant to be illustrative. There is not a single technology or all technologies that just feature about 10 gigawatts in the tool. This is meant to illustrate sort of how currently contracted, currently in the queue, and then ultimately potential resources phase into the supply curve. Up first in the very near term here, actual contracted capacity enters the supply curve at its proposed commercial operation date. By contracted, we mean a NYSERDA REC contract. If we do not want that potential, if we want that potential to be not considered in the supply curve, so that a capacity expansion model does not consider it, those can be toggled off. That means the next capacity that comes into the curve are the interconnection queue projects that are, projects that are either in the interconnection queue or in early planning, but do not hold a current contract with NYSERDA. And so they'll be phased in as the values that are phased in earlier will be more advanced in their development. They'll have a feasibility study in hand, full site control, that sort of thing. And then basically all remaining technical potential is phased in last. Land-based resources phase in from 2028 to 2035, with the more cost-effective resources being included earlier. And then for offshore wind, that phase in occurs from 2032 to 2036, and that comes in 5 equal tranches of megawatts. For those floating offshore wind areas, as I mentioned, the phase in really just occurs in 2038 and 2039, and it's finalized by 2040. And that is the phase-in approach in a nutshell. I also want to touch on aggregation. One alternative method for using the resource blocks that we wanted to provide was an aggregated version. I guess I'll start from the beginning here. There are 483 solar and land-based wind resource blocks defined in the model. It's approximately half and half solar and wind. These are defined by county, by project size, by distance to the existing transmission system. As an assist, in order to maintain reasonable computation time in capacity expansion modeling specifically, we undertook an exercise to aggregate these resource blocks into a total of 135. So that resulted in 80 solar blocks, 55 wind blocks. The goal of the aggregation was to try and preserve as much detail as possible while making it more time effective to enter these into a capacity expansion model. And the way we collapsed them was by taking counties with less than 150 megawatts of potential capacity or with very similar costs for all of the solar or wind sites. And those were collapsed into a single resource block. We also looked at counties with substantial capacity costs that were estimated to vary by more than 10%. And instead of collapsing those resource blocks together, we bucketize them, summarize them in typically 1 to 2 cost buckets within a county so that we can maintain the granularity of those particular resource blocks. We do not want to dilute their expense by collapsing more expensive with more affordable resources. And we think that this exercise will strike a balance if this format is used. It strikes a balance between the granularity, the county level granularity of the full-on supply curve resource blocks with a more accessible 135 block stack up. And the charts on the right-hand side here, we think, show that as they overlay the cumulative capacity versus cost of the sort of before and after of the resource block aggregation. But anyways, I'm going to move on from that. Happy to field questions about it shortly here. We'll take a quick look through results, and then we'll be wrapping up here shortly. I am just going to look at solar at the moment, but again, the total values for all 3 technologies are available in the attached materials. Solar resource potential, as a result of the supply curve work, tops out at about 72 gigawatts by 2040. For CapEx, we see a somewhat steady decline, leveling out or starting in approximately the $1,800 per kilowatt. This is in AC value in the near term here, ending at about 1,400. I will note that the bump upwards in the early to mid 2030s captures the entrance of less cost-effective sites being filtered into the supply curve. For OPEX, we say much more steady decline over time. And for interconnection, we see, again, I will just note this increase near the tail end represents the interconnection costs of facilities that are generally on the smaller side, generally around that 5 to 20 megawatt range, entering the system and paying disproportionately large interconnection costs to do so. That is actually the end of the slides that I had prepared for this. So in the interest of time, I think I will cut it off there. I'm happy to switch over to Q&A, but Skylar, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And we did get a lot of really great questions in the chat that we're going to jump to in a second. I'm going to start with an overview that will actually answer the first question in the chat as well about how we're using this model in this CGPP process. And I probably should have started with that, but the process here is that in the CGPP, stage one is developing the assumptions and running the capacity expansion modeling that the NISO will be running for us. And that capacity expansion modeling in Plexos has to make a decision in any given year, what resources does it need to build to meet the load that we have in that year? And typically in a very basic model, you would have, a single cost for each resource, solar costs $5, wind costs $6 or whatever. And the model has to choose how many of each of those resources to build to match the load shape. As we've gone through time over the last 10 years, we've tried to get more and more granular with this to figure out, well, what are those different costs on a zonal basis, on a regional basis? What would it be, if I did it 5 years from now versus today? And then trying to layer in things like, well, what's the interconnection cost look like? How far is it away from actual transmission lines? And this work is kind of the culmination of that, where we now have a tool that's able to show us from a very granular level, what are all the quote unquote feasible solar, wind, and offshore wind sites that would be available to a model that is trying to build out enough renewable resources to hit all of our targets by 2040. And that just means, the result of this supply curve work is basically the input to the capacity expansion modeling. This is just the available capacity that the model can choose from. This is not all the resources that will be built. This is just all the resources that are available to be chosen by a model between now and at the end of our modeling timeframe to meet those loads. And so what's great about this work is now we can actually provide the NISO with details on a county level basis that actually represent, those geographical differences, the differences in resource, quality in terms of solar installation and wind speed, those types of things, but also layering this key new factor of like, how much is it going to cost to potentially interconnect these things if we already know by the GIS that it's much, much further away from interconnection points. So this tool has been able to layer on a lot of those great details that we've learned over time that it would be good to have. This tool is able to bring all that stuff together, and we're able to populate the database of the Plexos modeling tool to see all this stuff. So it now has a lot more educated modeling guesses to make as it's optimizing for cost and energy over the time. So that's really how we're doing it. There's not a maximum build for any given year necessarily. It's really just seeding the model with these cost and availability numbers. So hopefully that answers, that clarifies things for folks, but also answers Radhika's question. Is that right? Okay. I think that'll do it. So we can move now to some of the more pointed questions, direct questions to you all at NYSERDA about the modeling. The first one is on floating offshore wind. Are there any assumptions for when you would have to start the interconnection process to be commercially ready for something such as the 2038 COD in the model?
I might have to throw that over to our power advisory folks. But if we don't,
I think this might actually be more of a modeling question that I might be able to take a swing at over here, where in both the supply availability and the capacity expansion modeling, there isn't really a representation of that queue process. We have this being available in 2038 because that's when we think it might be first able to come online. And that's kind of representing a thought that maybe in the next 5 years, this will be a long-term plan and folks can start that process. So there's not an explicit representation of the queue process in the capacity expansion modeling. It's really kind of just there implicitly by the phase-in approach that we take for the different resources. That answer your question, Nick?
Yeah, that absolutely does, Schuler. Yeah, in my mind, I think, yeah, it's a good assumption that we need to be thinking of these new technologies, right, coming in on the horizon, but also to that point, because it's not, defined and commercially ready now, that we're also considering kind of, okay, when do we need to revisit certain assumptions like this and refine them, based off of what comes to pass.
That's a really good point, especially as we do expect to have more than one cycle of the CGPP. We expect technologies to advance in between now and then. That goes to your second question too about a comparable 10-year development time assumption for floating offshore wind. Just, making sure we are building any of these new processes and timelines and technologies into the phases as we go. Okay, we have another quick question. What's the capacity factor that we showed for offshore wind?
Yeah, I can take that one. This is Andrew Kinross with Power Advisory. So our assumption for capacity factor for offshore wind was 48%. It ranged from 44 to 51, and we had a subcontractor, Philip Bader, who's done a lot of work in that area. He's not on the call today, but yeah, that was our assumption in that case.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question on the phone on that one. Do you have that cap factor by seasonality as well? So like a spring, winter, fall type cap factor?
For the purposes of our modeling for this project, we just had an annual capacity factor.
And I can take the rest of that, Andrew.
Sure.
The phasing, when we have these capacity factors in the supply curve model, but when we pick it up and move it to the NISO's modeling tool, we have the various generation shapes on a sub-kilometer basis, taken from various sources, including the NREL offshore wind database that the NISO has been using and some EIA data. That's very granular production data that's on an hourly basis for a whole year. So that's kind of gets balanced in there because you're right, Chris. There's a lot of variability in capacity factor over the course of the year and via by resource. So we are taking that into account with the NISO's granular production data. Okay, there's another question here about is the floating and non-floating offshore wind differentiated by CapEx?
Yes, so the answer to that is it is. And in the, I believe in the deck today, we would have shown the fixed bottom, but we have two different CapExes for fixed and floating.
So I'll just jump in on this. In the main section of the deck where we talk about input assumptions, that's for fixed bottom. Near the end of the deck, when we look at results, that's a weighted average of all of the offshore wind. So you'll notice in 2038, that average jumps up as the floating wind gets incorporated.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question. Do we include end-of-life recovery and recycling cost? I'm not sure that's actually a supply curve question, but it is a modeling question in our capacity expansion modeling. The end-of-life costs are not really represented in these in the modeling. The modeling that we're doing with the NISO only goes till 2042, so we're not really seeing those end-of-life costs that might occur later in the time period. If we get to a point where we do have a significant quantity of resources that might need to be recovered or recycled, we could consider that in future CGPP cycles, but I don't think we have it today. But on the second part of that question, that's in the chat about having fixed O&M schedules about the various components that might need to be replaced over time, we do have the long-term O&M built in to make sure the capacity can be maintained over the life of the resource. So we are representing kind of those individual replacement costs for all resources, including storage, but it's just not part of this supply curve analysis.
Well, just one comment on that, Skylar. Just on our side, when we developed our O&M estimates, we did include that. So, for example, in solar, inverters get replaced, might get replaced after 10 or 15 years, and then might get replaced again after 10 or 15 years. And so, our assumption there was we did have like a flat O&M number. That was a levelized number over time. In actual fact, the way the cash flows from O&M flow are different than that. But for simplicity, we worked in a levelized cost of these kind of one-time costs, if you will, into our O&M costs.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question about how the GIS tool may have mapped to the state or federal disadvantaged communities designations. Do we have a kind of like a filter for that or a sort for that?
Yeah, Greg, do you want to take that one?
I don't believe we looked at the full disadvantaged communities list. For the ITC modeling, we did incorporate energy communities.
Yeah, that's true. I don't believe NYSERDA directed Power Advisory to factor in disadvantaged communities in the GIS analysis, and then that wouldn't have factored, so therefore that wouldn't have flown through to the resource blocks.
Thank you. Yeah, for the supply curve analysis, yeah, that makes sense. For the CGBP modeling, we will have those disadvantaged communities maps as a reference for all the modeling that we are doing as well, if we need to augment any of those costs or generation availability in those areas. And there was another great follow-up question to that one about this tool and how much of this tool we think we'll be able to make available to folks. Is this something, I mean, my preference has been this whole time to be able to have that, the results of this tool posted with the EPPAC members, because we will have it, some version of it posted with the NYSO as well anyway. So is this something we could put a timestamp on, you think, Mac, when this might be available?
I don't think I can put a timestamp on it right now. We are trying to finalize this tool as soon as possible. So it's ready for modeling next month, which means we're trying to finalize it in the next few days. We're gonna have to take that back and get back to you. I don't think I can speak on exactly what the rollout plan is at the moment for the general public.
Sounds good. But we do, for EPPAC members, we do plan on having, at the very minimum, the final sheet, the final portion of the sheet showing the resource availability and costs for the EPPAC members, even if it's not, just posted on the NYSERDA website for the whole general public. We do want to have that available to you all as soon as we can.
Thank you for that. And yes, as we go forward, it'll be great to have access to as much as possible. Thank you for that. And I just want to follow up on the DACs. So I'm hearing, is it correct that they're maybe somewhat not inconsistent, but there's going to be an energy communities designation for one set of modeling, but then a DAC mapping for the other? Is that something that, could be consolidated so that we could have that be consistent, or is there,
I think, and just to clarify, the energy communities filter was mostly applied so that we could determine whether the investment tax credit bonus adder for energy communities could be applied to certain projects. It wasn't necessarily that we wanted to only consider that and not the disadvantaged communities filter. So I would not say that there's a one iteration and the other upcoming.
all right. Just so I'm hearing that when we're looking at that particular tax credit, we just have to be cognizant that it's for energy communities and not DACs.
Yes.
All right.
That's correct.
Okay, we have a few more questions coming in here. One is, do we have an updated energy storage cost and max potential? Yes, we do. That's not part of the supply curve work here, I don't believe, is it, Mac? I think we're relying on the NYSO's work that they've done on the energy storage costs and O&M, which are, very important. O&M costs are very important to storage. the NISO has working assumptions built into their production cost models already, and we'll be relying on those as opposed to some build out from this work.
Yeah, that's
And then-
right.
yeah.
Just to confirm, energy storage is not considered in this iteration of the supply curve model. The focus was asked to be just wind, solar, and offshore wind.
Yeah, and that was primarily driven by the resource availability being a big question and siting. You know, you need a lot more land area for 100 megawatts of solar than you do for 100 megawatts of storage. Just to throw some numbers out there, from NYSERDA's storage program, we had been averaging something around 30 to 40 megawatts per acre. So 100 megawatts of storage, you might only need a few acres to do 100 megawatts of storage, as opposed to, you know, hundreds or thousands of acres for similarly sized renewable resources. So that's why that wasn't necessarily, you know, as relevant to this type of GIS analysis. But we will need, you know, that's why we're laying around things like, you know, DAC maps and interconnection points in the capacity expansion modeling, because all that stuff is still relevant to siting large scale storage as well. But we will have those costs and O&M data from the NISO in the capacity expansion modeling. And then the next question is that same question, but for hydrogen, and it's a similar answer. We do have a representation for hydrogen costs and potential that will be taken from the Climate Action Council integration analysis. There's in the matrix that was sent around, there's a link there for the data on that we'll be using for the hydrogen availability and cost. So if you want to, you know, take a look at that and then reach out to us for more questions, we can loop the E3 and the NYSERDA team in that worked on developing those numbers over the years. And it looks like we do have some of them on the call today if there's a follow-up question on that. We have one question on, in addition to energy storage, will this extend to DERs so that capacity expansion might consider DERs beyond state program inputs? This is a really interesting question and something that we hope to solve more holistically in future CGPP cycles. The capacity expansion modeling itself has a county level representation of the resource availability, but only a zonal representation of the transmission capacity. And so the only way we'd be able to differentiate today between distribution and transmission connected resources is if we put some form of cost delta in there for the model to consider. And the issue with doing that is if we put a multiplier on there for added cost for DERs or a cost reducer or something, it really kind of would tend to confuse the model if you don't also have a representation of the distribution network that is operating on. And so one of our approaches here has been to rely on the load forecast to take into account the amount and location of the DERs that we expect to show up, targeting the 6 gigawatt storage goal, the 10 gigawatt behind the meter. Well, the NISO calls it behind the meter. It is actually, you know, distribution sited PV. Those, from the wholesale perspective, from that zonal perspective, are load modifiers. And so those will be basically hard coded into the model out till at least 2030, maybe even 2040 at this stage. I don't think we have a representation in the NISO's modeling framework that can allow the capacity expansion model to choose anything at a lower voltage at the moment, but that is something we hope to develop over time. But right now it can't choose, oh, I'd rather put this on the distribution network as opposed to the transmission network. Was there any clarification on that, Bill?
Yeah, thanks, Skylar, for taking up that question, and I appreciate the answer. And I'm very pleased that you're going to be looking at how you can think about doing that in the future, because it strikes me that you know, we have this kind of gap. You know, you always think about the electrical system in a way in two worlds. You know, the distribution and the wholesale, and you know, the choice in capacity expansion going forward with the large grid upgrade costs. And the reason why we're having the whole discussions here with this coordinated grid planning process. You know, it strikes me that there's going to be an opportunity here to consider much higher penetrations of DERs that would hopefully avoid a lot more of the grid build out in some of these models going forward. And I realize it's very challenging to do that right now, but I would highly recommend that we do make a significant initiative to focus on the ability to do that, because I think I know from your work you did previously in NYSERDA, you saw this as an opportunity, and I think it is a real opportunity that we need to consider.
Right. Because in reality, there are those actual decisions can be made about, whether we build out a few more 5 megawatt resources or, site a 20 megawatt resource at a higher voltage. Those decisions happen in real life, and we hope to represent those a little bit better in future cycles. So I think we just have 2 more questions, and then we'll open it up to any other questions from, that people had about, previous discussions or questions about any other pieces of the matrix. So the last 2 are, when you look at what can be built, do you use annual values that are reflected in that chart, or do you use the end value, the total potential at the end of the horizon for each technology? Some zones are showing little potential, so that potential might be met fast, and transmission constraints could be important at that point.
Let's see. I'm not 100% sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I think this might be a question about how the model might actually be able to see this. And I think the answer is actually that we'll be using the values that are more reflective of the chart. I don't think we're going to allow the model to just, see all those megawatts, all that potential on day 1 and build all of it day 1 if it wants to. The phase-in approach is really important to represent, what is actually in the queue that has any hope of being built in the next, a small amount of years, 3 to 5 years. And then other things will come in to replace it, but not all, for example, 72 gigawatts of storage are going to, or solar are going to come in today to be built in 3 years. So we need to phase that into the model. But you're right, some of these zones, you run out of resource availability pretty quickly. And the model will have to choose either, building new transmission or building other resources to meet that load. So that is a really good observation. I see Liz has her hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to, quick time check. I think you were doing that as well, but I just want to mention that we do have administrative and scheduling and other matters like that to take care of. We may, Skylar, I think we may run out of time today, but we will definitely follow up with everybody about that after the meeting.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think there's only, there was 2 questions left, but now there's also 2 questions left because another one came in while I was talking. So do you all have a sense of how the costs that you have presented here compared to NREL costs?
Yeah, let me start, and then Greg, I'll have you chime in as well. So, yeah, the NREL process, it's an annual process. They actually lock in some of their forecasts, some number of months even before they publish their document. I believe it was published in June or July of this year. And what we found is that those costs tended to not reflect some of the increases in these CapEx and OpEx costs over the course of the past 12 months. So, where the market is today is higher. Certainly on the wind side, there was a very large discrepancy between what we found on the wind side in the marketplace in New York today and what NREL published. The other thing to keep in mind is NREL publishes national average numbers. They don't publish regional or state numbers. So, our job was to find out what's going on in New York State for these technologies. So, there's a little bit of apples and oranges going on there, but generally the wind costs were our costs were quite a bit higher than NREL's, and I believe our solar costs were also higher, but not as there wasn't as much of a difference as there was with wind. Greg, anything to add on that? Because I know you took a pretty close look at this.
Just to throw out a number, we are about 30% higher than NREL on CapEx for all three resource types we looked at, with some specific details that you'll be able to see.
Okay, Aaron, I
Okay,
see
well,
your hand up. Did you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, actually, and follow up with your previous response as well, Skylar, so thank you. But with regards to the cost, fair enough that it's different. Just out of curiosity, there's in the presentation that was distributed, it's slide 15, it shows trends, downward trends of solar, and then it shows different high, medium, and low for land-based winds. Do you differ significantly from NRELs for the slope, the change over time?
I believe the answer, and Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the slope is probably on solar is similar. It's just that the starting points are different. Greg, is that what you found?
I think so. I think we are closer to the slope for NREL on solar. I know for wind, we don't have quite as much cost decline as NREL does.
Yeah. On the solar side, so the way NREL does their modeling is they take what they call the baseline, which is the current year, and then they apply learning curve rates. And sometimes these learning curve rates are the same learning curve rate for the entire forecast period, and sometimes they change up. What we're seeing in solar is that there's been this very large increase in CapEx. Module prices have gone up extremely high for a whole host of reasons. Single axis tracker costs have gone up, labor costs have gone up. Our forecast is that some of these equipment costs are going to decline in the next 5 years, and then they'll begin increasing on a nominal basis, but still increasing at rates that are below inflation. And so on a real basis, we see some kind of significant declines in the first 5 years, and then then it becomes then smaller declines thereafter. And I think NREL's numbers are kind of a consistent, it's a consistent learning curve. So it's a consistent year-over-year price change.
Okay, thanks. I think we're gonna have to jump to we only have 7 minutes left, so I'm gonna just jump to the last couple questions. I think we can probably hit a couple all at the same time about interconnection costs, starting with offshore wind. What is assumed in those interconnection costs, and how are they forecasted?
Just very quickly, for offshore wind, we have different assumptions for the onshore upgrades depending on where that point of interconnection is, and then there is also cost for the export cable, which scales with distance. And in terms of forecasting those, I believe we kept them flat in real terms. We didn't have an assumption that interconnection would get cheaper or more expensive over time.
Thanks. And just to clarify, they're not representing any like local or deliverability upgrades that may be needed. This is primarily for interconnecting onto the system, right? There's not necessarily additional upgrades, are there?
Yeah, for offshore wind, no, we were just trying to capture the costs that the developer is responsible for.
Right. So that just to round out that full question, we will be looking at those other type of costs in the second and third stages of the CGPP, because it is obviously very important. You can build whatever you want and connect anything you want to a transmission network, but whether it gets delivered and actually meets load is another key part, and that leads to potential local and bulk system needs, and that's one of the key outputs of our modeling here in the first few stages of CGPP. One more, can you discuss how the distance to transmission interconnection points are accounted for as the resource sites are aggregated into blocks? Is it like averaged out between the sites that are aggregated?
Yes, so those distances are averaged together, and when we are aggregating sites together, distance to transmission is one of the considerations. So we're trying to aggregate like projects together.
Awesome, thank you. And then the last question that was in here is kind of something that may take a little bit more time to explain, but I'll try to take a really quick whack at it right now before we jump to the admin stuff. The question was, can we clarify how the model will basically see the resource targets versus the quote-unquote economic build-outs over time. So we do have a lot of policy targets in the CLCPA with 9 gigawatts of offshore wind, some behind the meter solar, and we have a storage resource target as well. Those resource targets are firm requirements in the model for those years. And so the model will essentially see them as forced or firm or economic builds, whatever term you want to use. They will be built by the year that the law says the resource will be built. And then all the other resources that are needed are chosen by the model based on the supply curve. The supply curve availability, obviously the first 9 gigawatts of wind and a lot of the solar and the storage, like those are available, and we'll see the availability, and they'll take up some of the amount of resource capability that's in the supply curve. And then everything else will also pull from the supply curve. But those first targets are going to be hit one way or another. And then the model will see all the other builds as well as we go. So it's kind of a mix, but those targets will kind of, as the term in the question, it will quote unquote force a given technology based on the policy. Okay, so I think. Oh yes, okay.
Skylar, real quick, the CapEx and the OpEx numbers that are currently in the model, those were done prior to any of the petitions that were filed at the commission, correct?
So the capacity model, so those are like the forecasted model from the supply curve. Is that what you're asking? Like, where did the
Correct.
CapEx? Okay,
Correct.
Mac, do you have a question, an answer for that?
I think just chronologically, they were being developed before the petitions were filed, yes. But maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. Is the question sort of whether the petitions would have impacted those costs?
Yeah, it's kind of, now that we're seeing maybe some changes in market numbers, will those be incorporated in, say, future versions?
Well, Andrew can correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess what I'll say is one of the reasons we conducted firsthand interviews with developers on the ground in New York was basically to capture the same sentiment that went into those petitions to the DPS, the inflation of costs, the hardships for project development. And so we tried to capture the sentiment of those petitions in the development of the CapEx and OpEx costs, although I don't think the actual filings themselves are being parlayed into the supply curve model.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so they actually were incorporated based on those discussions.
Essentially, yes. That's what we tried to do.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
essentially, we did this work, June, July, August, and particularly July and August, and so the forecasts are current as of July and August 2023, taking into account everything that we know about the market, these discussions we have with existing contract holders. And we do track these markets. We have, personally, I've tracked CapEx and OpEx for years. Yeah, so they're the most accurate forecasts that we have as of, a couple months ago, one month ago.
All
Thank
right.
you.
So with that excellent excellent response, I want to reserve this last 30 seconds just to say to folks, like, thank you so much for all the engagement today, the tons of great questions. There'll be more where this came from. We did finally get an EPPAC specific website up and running that has materials on it and has the dates of the meeting. So we're very excited about that. That will be coming out by email. I'll also post a link in the chat right here as we go. Oh my gosh, it just happened as I was saying it. But we do plan on having, as we said in the previous meetings, bi-weekly meetings if we can of the EPPAC. So we'll be sending around some information around trying to schedule those as we go. And just a heads up on the next meeting, we will be technically past the deadline for submitting this first batch of information to the NISO for their first stage of modeling, but we do understand that there may be open questions remaining about how specifically that capacity expansion model works and where some of this data has been coming from. So we are definitely open to having a dedicated meeting in the next couple weeks, going back through this scenario 1 and the capacity expansion modeling in general to get people very comfortable with that, because I think that would give us a really good foundation as we move through October and November in developing the assumption set for the scenario 2 and 3 that will be informing through this this EPPAC process. So thank you again, everybody, for giving us all your time. Let me see. I do see a hand. I was about to cut us off, but Nick, do you have something quick?
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, you triggered a thought when you're talking about scenario 2 and 3. And Nick Colbert, PSC Long Island. On behalf of the utilities, we're looking to propose kind of to start those discussions on scenario 2 and 3 at I would say around like the end of October, beginning of November. Some more context to that is we were thinking that we can provide some like a starting point recommendation to be scrutinized and reviewed and built off of, and furthermore utilize past experience from the phase 2 CapEx modeling to really hone in on, I would say, the most impactful variables that will probably give us the biggest bang for our buck to help kind of focus and hone in the conversation. That's what I wanted to toss out there for a rough timeline to bring that. I would say we're looking at end of October, beginning of November.
Yeah, if you all have something to propose, that would be really good timing, because I think we'd have everybody really caught up and the webpage built out, the materials shared in more detail, so we can get a good head start on those scenario 2 and 3 build outs. So thank you for that offer.
Well, I'm just concerned. I mean, this proposal is kind of thrown out at the end of the meeting. We're still waiting to get the updated schedule pursuant to the order. I just concerned about process in due time for that type of proposal.
Yeah, we have an updated schedule, and Skylar, we should make sure, and Jalila, we should make sure to get that around to people with this next communication.
Yeah, and just would be concerned about sort of, yes, that it's important that we have the ability to weigh into these pieces of the process.
Yeah,
but appreciate the utilities, willingness to explore putting some options on the table. I think we need to move the conversation forward.
To piggyback off that, I think it will be, as we're already finding out, right? There's a lot of variables, and the discussion can go a lot of different ways. So this is just kind of an aim to kind of, okay, this is a starting point. Feel free to scrutinize and break it up, right? I think that will help be a better building block than starting from scratch, and just based off the experience. And then in addition to that, be able to kind of lay out the different variables that are most impactful. I think will really help kind of hone in where we think we should focus the deviations from the state scenario.
All right. And again, I'm not thank you so much for that, Mr. Culpepper. It's just that, just appreciate that, if these type of proposals are made, they're made, in ways where folks can get on the same page about it. And because now we're over the meeting time, folks have already signed off. That's just my request. It's just process.
No, absolutely right. Understood. Yeah, it was a tight schedule. We'll try to squeeze it.
Very understandable.
And once again, apologies for how fast we're moving on this first one. I promise we'll have a lot more detail, a lot more time in between these meetings to review more materials as we develop the next few cases. And especially after we get the stage 1 stuff kicked off, a lot of this will kind of switch into review and planning. But appreciate everyone staying in the race here with us. So with that, thank you so much, everybody. And you'll be getting a follow-up communications from us on the new schedule, the link to the website, along with the new meeting materials, and some information about when we're trying to schedule the next couple of meetings through October. So thanks again, and you'll hear from us very soon. Have a good one.
Have a good day, all.